Welcome back to On the Same Page. We are on Daf Tes Zayin Amud Aleph, 16a of Maseches Kiddushin. We are starting from 5 lines down on the page where it says Uvishtar and with the document. So the Mishnah, second Mishnah of the parak, back on Yedalad Amud Beis 14b, the Mishnah had said that an Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave, is nikne bekesef uvishtar. That you can acquire the slave either with kesef, with money, or with the shtar, with the document. We previously discussed the acquisition of the slave with money, what the source for that is, and now we look at uvishtar, that he could be acquired with using a document. Asks the Gemara, Minalan, from where do we know that a document can affect the transaction, can affect the transferal of the Eved Ivri over to the master? So Amar Ula says, Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, with regards to an Amma Ivriya, with regards to a female slave, a Jewish maidservant, it says, Imacheres yikach lo, if he will take another as a wife. In other words, the pasuk is discussing the preference that the master marry the Amma Ivriya, or his son, marry her, and it references that if he takes another wife, so then he still has certain responsibilities. But it has this word, imacheres yikachlo, if he takes another. So the Gemara says, hikisha hakasuv la'acheres. So there's a comparison here between the Amma Ha'ivriya, the Jewish maidservant, and him taking a regular wife. That ma'acheres mekanya bishtar. Just like we know that a regular woman, a regular wife, you could do Kiddushin, you could acquire her as a wife with a shtar, with a document. So af Amma Ha'ivriya, we learn from there that also an Amma Ha'ivriya, a Jewish maidservant, could be acquired mekanya b'shtar, could be acquired with a shtar, and just like the female could be acquired with a shtar, so too a male slave can also be acquired with a shtar. So that's our source, that a Jewish slave can be acquired using a shtar. We're learning it from a hekesh, from a comparison, because the Torah juxtaposes and mentions a regular marriage basically in the context of the Jewish slave, in this case the maidservant, the Amma Ha'ivriya. So we learn one from the other, just like regular Kiddushin, regular marriage can happen through a shtar, so too the acquisition of a slave, a Jewish slave, can also happen through a shtar. Says the Gemara, Hanicha lemanda amar shtar Amma Ha'ivriya adon kosvo. That makes sense if you hold that when a Amma Ha'ivriya is transferred to and sold to a master, a Jewish maidservant, a Jewish girl sold to a master, that it's the master who writes the shtar, who writes the document and gives it over to the father. Elo lamanda amar av kosvo, but if you hold that it's the father who writes the document, mai ikolamemar, then what can you say? In other words, if we're trying to learn and compare the transfer of a slave from Kiddushin, so and saying just like by Kiddushin, you can give the husband can give the wife Kiddushin, give her a shtar to acquire her, so too by an Amma Ha'ivriya, and so too by a female slave, so too by a male slave. But if you hold that it's not even the master who gives the document to the father, but rather the father gives the document to the master, then this kind of doesn't even start, because the master is not even generally giving a document to that he would acquire the slave in this manner. As the Gemara explains, it says, De'itmar, it was said, Shtar Amma Ha'ivriya, the shtar, the document of an Amma Ha'ivriya, of a Jewish maidservant, Mi Kosvo, who writes it, who prepares it? Rav Huna Amar Adon Kosvo. Rav Huna says that it's the master who writes it, the one who's looking to acquire her, writes it, and he gives it to the father, like any other Kiddushin, any other acquisition, and That's what Rav Huna holds. Rav Chisda Amar Av Kosva. But Rav Chisda says that actually the father writes the shtar, and not the master. So explains the Gemara, Hanicha le Rav Huna. So this idea that we can learn that you can acquire a slave through a shtar makes sense according to Rav Huna. Because according to Rav Huna, it's the master who gives the document over to the father to acquire the Amah Ivriya. And just like it can be the document itself that works in a regular marriage, so too the document itself can affect the transaction in the case of an Amah Ivriya. And we can apply that also to a male slave. However, but according to Rav Chisda, that the master isn't even giving a shtar, isn't giving a document to the father. It's the father who's giving the document to the master. You can't say that the master can acquire that maidservant just with the document. He's not even giving the document. So according to Rav Chisda, we're left with the question, what is the source that the document itself can affect the transaction in the case of a Amah Ivriya, a Jewish maidservant, or in the case of a regular Eved Ivri, a male Jewish slave. So we need a new source. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Acha Bar Yaakov. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov says, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, again with regards to an Amah Ivriya, it says, Lo seitzei ketzeis ha'avadim. She does not go out like regular slaves go out. When a father sells his daughter to be a maidservant, so it says, Lo seitzei ketzeis ha'avadim, she's not going to go out like a regular slave. And this refers to the idea that by a Canaanite slave, there's certain events that can cause him to go free. So for example, if the master knocks out his eye or his tooth, or one of his limbs, so the Eved, a slave, goes free. That's if he's an Eved Kanani. But that's not the case for an Eved Ivri or an Amah Ivriya. That the master would be responsible to pay him for this, but he still doesn't go out early. He would wait till the 6 years are up. That would be true for an Amah Ivriya also. A Jewish maidservant would not go out early, because even though her master has injured her, he would have to compensate her for it, but she wouldn't go out early. So we have an inference, though. It says, Lo seitzei ketzeis ha'avadim. The Jewish maidservant doesn't go out in one of these manners like a Canaanite slave would, through if the master, let's say, knocked out his eye or tooth. Aval, but we can infer niknesi kikinyan avadim. She doesn't go out like avadim, like Canaanite slaves, but she could be acquired like Canaanite slaves. That's the inference. Because the pasuk says, Lo seitzei ketzeis ha'avadim. She doesn't go out like avadim, implying though that she does come in like avadim. She could be acquired like a Canaanite slave. How is a Canaanite slave acquired? Umayniu shtar. One of the ways we know that a Canaanite slave could be acquired is through a shtar, through a document. That again, the very handing over the document can affect the transaction. And so too, just like it's true for a Canaanite slave, we're learning it's also true for a Jewish slave. Whether it's a maidservant, whether it's a male manservant. Asks the Gemara, who says that that's the type of acquisition that we're referring to? Ve'ema, maybe we can say, Aval niknesi kekingin avadim umayniu chazaka. Maybe we should infer, but she could be acquired using the acquisition of a Canaanite slave. And what is it? Not shtar. Maybe it's not shtar. Maybe it's the other type of acquisition that works on Canaanite slave, which is chazaka. Chazaka means an act that indicates ownership. In the case of an Eved, in the case of a slave, so it would be making him do something for you. Making him do an act of work. That would be an act of chazaka, and that's enough to acquire a Canaanite slave. Again, if the circumstances allow for it, but the action, what we mean is that can affect the transaction. That once the slave does that one thing, that can affect the transaction. So maybe that's what we're coming to learn is true also by an Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave, but maybe it doesn't work through a shtar. Because again, we have an inference here. The Torah says, Lo seitzei k'tzei sabadim. She doesn't go out. A Jewish maidservant doesn't go out like a Canaanite slave, implying that she comes in. She could be acquired like a Canaanite slave. What way can she be acquired? At first we wanted to say that's our proof with a shtar. Just like a Canaanite slave is acquired with a shtar, so to a Jewish slave. But now the Gemara is saying, but maybe not. Maybe it means just like a Canaanite slave is acquired with chazaka, with an act that indicates ownership, so to a Jewish slave. But maybe shtar doesn't work. So Amar Kra says the pasuk, Gemara explains, the pasuk says, Visnachatem osam livnechem acharechem. It says with regards to Canaanite slaves that they become inherited to your children after you, implying osam bechazaka velo acher bechazaka. They are inherited through chazaka, but others are not inherited through chazaka. The pasuk somehow implies that they are, through speaking about it in terms of nachala, of inheritance, of handing off, so it's saying they're like property, the Canaanite slave. And so just like property is acquired through chazaka, so too the Canaanite slave is acquired through chazaka. But but there's an inference here. Yisnachatem osam. They are like an achala. They are like an achuza. They're like property, the Canaanite slave. But the Jewish slave is not. So therefore the Canaanite slave could be acquired with chazaka, but the Jewish slave cannot be acquired with chazaka. And so earlier when we inferred that there is a way that they are acquired which is similar to the Canaanite slave, what are we left with? We're left with shtar, with a document. So the Jewish slave could be acquired with a shtar. Says the Gemara, but how do you know that that's the way to go? Ve'ema, maybe you should say, osam b'shtar, v'lo acher b'shtar. Maybe you should say that again, it says, Visnachaltem osam livnechem acharechem, that the Canaanite slave is like inheritance, it's like property, and it's osam, they are like property, but not a Jewish slave. And in what way? Maybe it's in their ability to be transacted using a shtar, using a document. And maybe the inference should be that a document doesn't work by a Jewish slave. So to that we say, Haksiv lo seitzei k'tzei savadim. But we have the other verse which says that she doesn't go out like a Canaanite slave, but she comes in like a Canaanite slave. So basically we have conflicting drashos. We have one pasuk which is saying that Lo seitzei k'tzei savadim, the Jewish slave does not go out like a Canaanite slave, implying though that she could be acquired like a Canaanite slave. So it sounds like you could acquire a Jewish slave like a Canaanite slave. On the other hand, we have this idea that it says with regards to the Canaanite slave, Visnachaltem osam livnechem, that they are an achla, they are an achuza, they are property. And so some sort of transaction works by them, by Canaanite slave, but not by a Jewish slave. So we have one type of transaction that we're coming to be marbe, to include that it works by a Jewish slave, just like it works by a Canaanite slave, and one type of transaction that we're excluding. And we have two transactions. We have two types. We have shtar, a document, and we have chazaka. So the question is, which one's which? Which one are we coming to be marbe, to include? Which one are we coming to exclude? So the Gemara explains, Umarais, it says, what do you see to prefer to learn out that shtar, document, works and chazaka doesn't work? Says the Gemara, Mistabra shtar havalelu ribuye. It's logical to say that it's the shtar, it's the document that works. Why? Sheking motzi b'bas Yisrael. Because we find that a shtar is something that's very effective. You know how effective it is? It's such an effective mode of transaction that it can even be used to be motzi, to divorce one's wife with the shtar, with a get. So a shtar is extremely effective. So if we're going to choose one, either chazaka or shtar, and say that it works even by a Jewish slave, Shtar is the one that should work. The document, it's so effective. We even see it works to break up a marriage, to cause a divorce. Says the Gemara, Adrabah, though, on the contrary. Chazaka, Chazaka is so effective. Shekin Kone b'nichsei hager. Because we find that Chazaka works to create a transaction in a situation of nichsei hager. If you have a convert who dies and has no relatives, because a convert, after converting, it's kikatan shnol adami, it's like he was just born. He's no longer considered related to his parents or aunts and uncles. So a Jew who dies, there's always going to be someone that they're related to, or a Jew from birth. But a convert, if the convert has no children, then he may not be related to anyone, halachically. So what happens to his possessions? So it's kind of finders keepers. Whoever finds them first and makes a chazaka acquires them. So his possessions are ownerless. And that works to use chazaka to do a action that indicates ownership. So we see chazaka as something very effective. So again, we're stuck here. Which one works and which one doesn't? We know Canaanite slaves are acquired with both shtar and chazaka. We know that only one of them is being included by a Jewish slave and one of them is being excluded. So which one is it? So the Gemara says, Be'ishos mias lo ashkachan. At the end of the day, we don't see the effectiveness of a chazaka in the context of marriage. Yeah, it could acquire the possessions of a convert, but that has nothing to do with marriage. We do see the effectiveness of shtar, of a document in the context of marriage, in that it's so effective it could even make a divorce. So therefore, here where we're trying to be marbe one of these for the Amma Ha'ivriya, for the Jewish maidservant, which is a quasi-marriage, at the beginning of a marriage, meaning when she's acquired, when the Jewish maidservant is acquired, she's not yet married to her master, but it can turn into a marriage, and that can actually turn into the Kiddushin. So therefore, when we say that lo seitzei k'teisa avadim, that a Jewish maidservant doesn't go out like a Canaanite slave, but she could be acquired like a Canaanite slave, and we want to know what kind of acquisition are we talking about. Are we talking about a shtar, or are we talking about a chazaka? So which one? They're both very good, but we know it's only one of them because the other one is excluded. So it's going to be shtar. It's going to be a document because we see the effectiveness of a document in the context of marriage. And this is the context of marriage, because this acquisition of the maidservant can actually turn into a marriage. And so it's shtar that works. And we're going to learn from the maidservant to a manservant that just like shtar works to acquire a female slave, a maidservant, so too it can work to acquire a male slave. Says the Gemara, or another possibility, another way that we know to prefer shtar over chazaka is lahachyahani imacheres. That's what their other verse imacheres can still teach me. So you remember how we started? We started out suggesting that the source that a Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave, can be acquired through a shtar. Our first suggestion was that we learn it from the juxtaposition with the regular marriage, because in the context of a maidservant it says imacheres ikachla, if he takes another wife. So they're juxtaposed, and we said just like another wife, a regular wife can be married through a shtar, so too, when he takes his maidservant, it could be through a shtar. Now we asked, that makes sense if you hold that the master gives the document to the father. But if you hold that the father gives the document to the master, then where do you see how is that's not going to work on a normal basis, that he's not even giving the document. So we said, fine, that's true if you're trying to learn from Kiddushin. but we can learn from a Canaanite slave where a document affects the transaction that it even works when even if you hold that the father is giving the document to the master, but you can still affect the transaction because we're learning from a Canaanite slave where a document affects the transaction. Fine, but how do we know that it's the document and not the chazaka? How do we know to prefer to learn that it's a document that works? So that's where we look to imacheres yikach lo. Because in the same context, it talks about a regular marriage, which is done through a shtar, which is done through a document. So we see, we'll at least take from there, we're going to glean from there this one important piece of information, which is to prefer the method of shtar over chazaka in terms of what we're going to learn. Because over there, it's effective to do it through a shtar, through a document, and not through chazaka. You can't marry a woman with a chazaka. So therefore, now we're going to apply that idea to over here in terms of what kind of transaction to prefer. What are we going to learn from the Canaanite slave? We're going to learn shtar, we're not going to learn chazaka. Says the Gemara of Rav Huna. Rav Huna, who didn't need all this, because Rav Huna held that it's the master who gives the document to the father. And therefore he said you could learn it from a regular Kiddushin that shtar works. So so what does he need this other verse for? The verse which said that she doesn't go out like a Canaanite slave, but she could be acquired through a Canaanite slave, which Rav Chisda was using to learn that shtar works. But Rav Huna doesn't need that. He already knows that shtar works because he learns it from Kiddushin. So what does he do with this pasuk? What does Rav Huna do with this pasuk? He needs it really for the simple meaning of the verse. The simple meaning is she doesn't go out like Canaanite slaves, and Canaanite slaves go free if a limb is broken or an eye is knocked out. If the master injures him in one of these ways, he goes out. One of the essential limbs, or an eye or a tooth, but the maidservant doesn't go out like that. That's all he needs the pasuk for, the simple meaning of the verse. Rav Chisda responds, Im kein lichtov kra lo seitzei ka'avadim. If that was all it was coming to teach me, it should just say she doesn't go out like slaves. My kitzei sa'avadim. Why does it say lo seitzei? She doesn't go out kitzei sa'avadim like the way they go out. Sort of repeats the word going out. Shma mina tarti, that's coming to teach me two things. So Rav Chisda says, yeah, it's teaching me the obvious meaning, the simple meaning of the verse, that she doesn't go out with shein ba'ayin, with she doesn't go free because she gets her eye knocked out. But there's also something else it must be teaching me, because it has that extra word kitzeis. It must also be teaching me that that she doesn't go out like a Canaanite slave, but she could be acquired like a Canaanite slave, and what manner of acquisition works shtar. Just like it works for a Canaanite slave, it works for her as well. Okay, the Gemara continues examining the Mishnah. The Mishnah continuing, it said, V'kones atzmo b'shanim, that a Jewish slave who reacquires himself goes free through years, meaning if 6 years elapse, he goes free. The Gemara explains, because the pasuk says, Sheish shanim ya'avod, he'll serve for 6 years, uvashvi'is v'gomer, and in the 7th year, yetzei lachav shichinam, he goes free. So it's an explicit verse that he goes free after 6 years. Then the Mishnah said, B'yovel, he also goes free if he decides to stay on longer and get his ear pierced, so he'll go free at Yovel. T'chsiv, as the pasuk says, Ad shnas hayovel ya'avod imach, until the Yovel year, the Jubilee year, he will serve with you. So also an explicit verse teaching that. He also goes out b'girayon kasef. The third way the Mishnah said that a Jewish slave could go free is with girayon kasef, with redeeming at a prorated rate. So the Gemara says, Amar Chizkiah. Chizkiah explains what's the source for that. The Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, in the context of the female slave, of the maidservant, v'hefta, that she will be redeemed, but the way that the tense of it implies that somehow the master is involved in her becoming redeemed, and that's Milami, that teaches you Shemigarea Pidyona V'yotza, that he has to lower the cost of her redemption, and she goes out. In other words, that's the way that he's involved. The way he's involved, the pasuk implies that somehow the master is involved in her redemption and setting her free when she's redeemed for money. That's because he has to discount it, prorate it based on how long she's been working. Okay. Tana, we learned in a brisa, v'kones atzmo v'kesef u'v'shava kesef u'v'shtar. The brisa says that a slave could acquire himself either with money, with shava kesef, with something that has the value of money, that's valuable, u'v'shtar, or with a document. So bishlama kesef, I understand that he could go out for money, tuchsiv, as the pasuk says, mi kesef miknasa. It says that the verse says, if there's more time left, so he gives the money mikesef miknasa, from the cost of his acquisition, implying that he can buy himself out, to redeem himself. Shava kesef nami, and even just using shava kesef, something that's the value of money, also works, because it says Yashiv ge'ulaso, he will return the cost of his redemption, and that is seemingly extra, and that's coming to teach me that he could even use shava kesef. He can use just something that's the value of money. It doesn't have to actually be cash. That's Amar Rahmana. The Torah says Yashiv ge'ulaso, he'll return the amount of his redemption. L'rabo shava kesef ke'kesef, which is to teach me that the value of money, something of value, can also be used in place of money. But when we say that he could redeem himself, he could free himself with a shtar, earlier we were talking about the Eved being acquired through a shtar. Now we're saying he could redeem himself with a shtar. So, Hefidami, what does it mean? How does he redeem himself with a shtar? Ilema dekasavle shtara adame, if it means that he pays for his freedom, and then the master gives him a shtar, acknowledging his freedom. Hainu kesef. That's not redeeming himself with the shtar, that's redeeming himself with the money that he paid to redeem himself. Ella shichrur. So if it's a shtar shichrur, if the master is just releasing him and giving him a document of freedom, shtar lamali, why does he need the document? Leimole ba'ape tre zil. Just let the master say in front of two witnesses, go free, and just set him free. Why does he need to give him a document to set him free? Inami bape bedina zil, or let him go in front of a court and say, go free. But why is it necessary, if the master wants to set the slave free, just set him free? Why does he need to give him a document? So Amar Rava, Rava says, Zo Someres Eved Ivri Gufo Kanoi. What we learn from here is that in Eved Ivri's body is acquired. He's not just, meaning while he's a slave for those 6 years, he is the property of the master. He's not just owned for his work. We look at it like Gufo Kana, his body itself becomes the property. And Harav Shemachal Al Gerono and Gerono Machal. And for the master to just say go free and to forgive however much money is required to redeem him, it doesn't work. The only way to actually redeem him, because he's the property of the master now, at least during this time while he's a slave, the only way is to actually use, either for him to pay to redeem himself or to use an actual shtar. If he wasn't property, so then the master could just say go, you're free to go, and you don't need anything to affect an actual transaction. But says Rava, we see from the fact that the Mishnah said, this brisa says that in order for him to go free, other than through money, through actually redeeming himself, he needs a shtar. It means you need to have a transaction affected here to set him free. So that teaches me that he's actually considered the possession, the property of the master, at least during the time that he is to serve, during these 6 years, or if he remains on until Yovel. Okay, the Mishnah said that Yisera Alav Ama Ivriya, that a Ama Ivriya has an additional way to go free, a female slave has an additional way to go free that a male slave doesn't have, which is when she reaches puberty, when she has simanim, when she starts to show signs of adulthood, she goes free automatically. Amar Reish Lakish said, Ama ha'ivriya kones atzma b'misas ha'av merishus adon mikav v'chomer. Reish Lakish teaches us an interesting halacha. He says the halacha is that an Ama ha'ivriya goes free when her father dies. So her father sold her to this guy, and then he died. Says Reish Lakish, when her father dies, she goes free from her master. How do I know? Mikal v'chomer, he says. It's a kal v'chomer, a fortiori logic. Uma simanin she'en motziim merishus av. Motziim merishus adon. He says, if it's true that simanin, that reaching puberty, frees her from the master, like we just said, but yet it doesn't free her from her father. Her father still maintains certain rights over her while she's, at least until she reaches Bagrus. So, but when she's a Naira, when she just shows signs of adulthood, she's not yet free from her father. But yet that frees her from her master. So, Misa, Shemotzia Mershus Av, Einodin Shemotzia Mershus Adon. Her father's death, which does free her from her father's possession, so all the more so that it should free her from the master's possession. So just one more time, the logic is if simaning, if signs of puberty free her from the master, but they don't free her from the father's death, which does free her from the father, all the more so should free her from the master. So that's Reish Lakish's halacha. When the father dies, she goes free. Meisvei Rav Hoshia. Rav Hoshia asked a contradiction from our Mishnah. The Mishnah said, Yisera alav ama ha'ivriya shekones atzma b'simanim. The Mishnah said that ama ha'ivriya has something additional, which is that she acquires herself with simanim. By reaching puberty, she goes free. That's in addition to, the male slave doesn't go free just because he reaches adulthood, but the female does. Now, Vimisa, if it was true that she also goes free when her father dies, which is what Reish Lakish is teaching us, Nisni Nami Misasav. The Mishnah should have said that. Should have said Yisera Olav. Another additional point that the maidservant has over the manservant is that she goes free when her father dies. So it must not be true. Says the Gemara, no, Tana v'Shayir. No, the Mishnah left out things. It didn't list everything. So the Gemara says, My Shire to High Shire. So what else didn't it list? Meaning we have a rule in general that if the Mishnah lists some things, it's okay for it to leave other things out, as long as there's more than one thing that it's leaving out. But it doesn't just leave out one thing. So if it's Yisera Allah, if there's additional ways that a maidservant goes out over a manservant, and the Mishnah only says, you know what's additional? She goes out when she reaches puberty. Okay, so why didn't it say that she goes out when her father dies? Oh, because there's other things. So we want to know, so what are those other things? If there are no other things, then it should have said this one other thing of her father dying. You're saying there's other things? Okay, what are the other ways? So the Gemara says, My Shire to High Shire, what else did it leave out? Shire Misasa Adon. It left out when the master dies. Another way that she goes out is if her master dies, she also goes out. So the Gemara says, Imishum Misasa Adon Lav Shirahu. That's not something left out. Dekima Dikanami B'ish Lo Ktani. That's true also by a manservant, that if his master dies, he goes free. So, the Eved Ivri. So it couldn't have been in the list. Yisera Olav. In addition, the additional things that the maidservant has over the manservant, it can't say additionally that she goes free when her master dies, because that's true for an Eved Ivri also. Ve'ala Nisni. So then why didn't it say this additional point that Reish Lakish is telling us that she goes free when her father dies? Says the Gemara, Tana Davar Sheyesh Lo Kitzva Ktani. The Mishnah taught things that have a defined time, davar she'ein lo kitzva lo ktani, and things that do not have a defined time, it did not mention. So all the examples that the Mishnah gives have a defined time or a defined amount of money, meaning it's a defined point. It doesn't range. So for example, it mentioned kesef, it mentioned money, it mentioned years, 6 years, Yovel, 50, the Jubilee year. That everybody knows exactly when it is or how much it is, right? If she was bought for a certain amount, you'll know how much it is to redeem her. Those are defined points. But when she's going to reach puberty, sorry, excuse me, the Gemara is going to ask about that. But whether the father is going to die or not, that's not going to define or not. That's not known. So therefore, it only mentioned things that are known and defined. It didn't mention things that are unknown and undefined. Says the Gemara, Vasimanim, but what about her reaching puberty? That's not defined when exactly that's going to happen. It's different for each person. Denglam Kitzva, Ktanya, there's no specific time frame for that. Each girl is different, and yet it mentions it, that she goes free when she reaches puberty. So if we're not mentioning things that are undefined, then why is it mentioning that? So Rav Safra explained, it's true that there's no kitzvah, there's no defined point on top, but there is a defined point on bottom. In other words, if a boy or girl doesn't show signs of puberty until past the regular age, so then we wouldn't consider them an adult until they show those signs. So there's no kitzvah lemala. It's undefined in terms of on top, but it is defined on bottom. In other words, if they show early signs of puberty, so we'll dismiss it and we'll assume that it's not actually puberty, it's something else. As the Brisa goes on to explain, Ditanya, top of the next page, Ditanya, as we're learning a Brisa, this Brisa I think is talking about a boy. It says Ben Teisha Shanim Shehevi Shtei Cyrus. If a 9-year-old produced 2 hairs, pubic hairs, Shuma, we assume that it's some kind of mole or something, it's not puberty. Mi ben teisha shanim b'yom echad ad ben yud beis shana b'yom echad. What about if he's between 9 years old and 12 years old and 1 day? So, the Odan bow, and he still has it. So still, Shuma, we would still say that's a Shuma, that's just a mole, it's not a sign of purity. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Simen. Rabbi Yossi disagrees and says, no, at that point, we would say that it's a siman, that it is a sign of puberty at that point. Ben Yogimel Shana B'Yom Echad Divrei Hakol Siman. Once a boy is 13, so everybody will agree that that at that point it is a siman, it is a sign. Even I guess the point is that even though it appeared earlier, so you might say, oh, that's something else. That was just a mole. That was something else. No, we say once he's 13, everybody agrees that we would assume at that point that it's a sign of puberty. But so this is talking about a boy. But the point is true for a girl also, that if the signs of puberty come too early, then we dismiss it. So there's kitzva lamata. There is a defined point on the early end, and kitzva lamala. There's no defined point on top. But this satisfies the Mishnah's limitation of only talking about things that have kitzva that are somewhat defined, and that's the reason the Gemara is justifying why it can still leave out misa sa'av, the death of the father, even though Reish Lakish teaches us that when the father dies, the Amal Evriya goes free when her father dies, but since it's not a defined thing, so it's left out in the Mishnah. The Mishnah only talked about things that are more or less defined in terms of when or how much they can, how much it will cost or when it will happen, such as Yovel or 6 years or even puberty, which is somewhat defined in terms of the earliest that it can be, which is when she reaches 12 years old.